Roger is the Senior Advisor for Climate Research and the Director of the National Integrated Drought Information System for NOAA. Roger's research and publications focus on climate and risk management in the U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean. He has been known to give testimony before Congress and live to tell a tale. He's a convening lead author on something or other, IPCC and other, and serves in advisory roles on climate science adaptation and services to the Western Governors Association, CARICOM, the OAS, UN, and other people who will listen to him. Roger, I don't know what you're doing over there, but could you come on?
Oh, yes, thank you. All right, thank you. I was trying to encourage Dave to be a little bit more optimistic. You know, as people ask me with all these things that are going on, sort of like, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And I told them, I once thought about being a pessimist, and I thought that's not going to work. All right, so we have quite a stellar panel. It's great to see so many friends and luminaries from Arcade and Mike Hall, and a bunch of other people. Mickey, hi. Okay, so let's see where we are. Let's take a look at some of this stuff. I'm moderating the extreme. We have some serious people ahead of us. Madeleine, Thomson, Manu, Carina, Bachofen, and Alberto Troccoli, all of whom we know. I wanted to keep some stuff in mind. You know, one of the great things about gathering like these, I always tell people 2 days at a meeting could save you almost 3 hours on Google. The issue is that it's really important to have a face-to-face sort of discussion, right? So I'm going to set this discussion up. What have we been hearing? Adaptation deficits, the continuum, El Niño, sure, La Niña, a bunch of stuff in between. Decadal variability, the short term to the long term. We've also been hearing a lot about the drivers, right? What makes us work on these timescales? What are the decisions that are taking place? We're going to hear a little bit more about that, from early warning to real source allocation to infrastructure design. And one of the things you're going to hear in a lot of these is how the short-term decisions we make constrain or enable long-term risk, and how we learn. So to finish, I'd like to put up this slide. It's called overconfidence. Some of you might have seen me put it up before. The cat is going, wait a minute, I'm using my models here. I've seen this before. It's a boy. Has feathers? Right, and check. Has a beak? Check. But this is a different kind of bird, right? And what we're seeing around the world is the analog from 97, 98 to the present. And what we want to ask is, are our expectations being realized? Yes, some areas they are, but some other things are being learned. So the cat is going, I can take it. And the eagle is going, what the hell are you thinking? This is the nature of a changing climate as well, right? The fact that it fits with some of our assumptions, but it doesn't fit with others. So what's the fundamental issue here? When and how often should we revise our assumptions, and who does the learning, all right? And then what actions take place from that? I try not to learn anything. So. All right, to start with, we have Madeleine Thomson, who is going to speak to us about health issues. I want to set the context here. I chair something called the Climate Service Information System for the WMO. The talks you're about to hear fit into the pillars and the priorities of the global framework of climate services. And so we'll start with health. Madeleine is the Senior Research Scientist at the IRI, Director of the IRI, PAHO, WHO Collaborating Center on Early Warning Information Systems and other climate-sensitive diseases. Trained originally as an entomologist. I didn't know that. Excellent. You know, E.O. Wilson kind of thing. Okay, expanded to include air and waterborne infections. That's pretty interesting. All right, shall we start? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, and good morning to everybody. I'm just going to, in the 2 minutes I have, just to try and capture some, hopefully large ideas, but in some smaller examples. And first, in wanting to talk about health, I want to distinguish between health as in how we experience health, and health as in terms of the health system and the health sector. When we experience our own health, that is actually an outcome of a whole range of things. It's our genetics, it's our food, it's the sanitation, the environment that we live in, our mental health, etc., etc. What the health sector deals with is very specific. It deals with disease, it prevents certain largely infectious diseases. It has a very controlled systems approach to doing things. Now, I just want to use malaria as an example, but what I'm really interested in here is thinking more about the system and how climate, and particularly El Niño, but other aspects of the climate, can be understood by a system that is trying to manage disease and prevent infection. And the reason for choosing malaria is obviously being a critical part of the MDGs. It's very climate sensitive in some areas, and really when it's not controlled, it's climate sensitive. And then of course the issues around expansion and re-emergence in Europe and North America have brought it into the dialogue of the malaria change community. We know from studies, not just in Africa, but all around the world, that malaria is very sensitive to El Niño. This is studies from Botswana in southern Africa, when there's an El Niño, it tends to be dry, and the red bars are the anomalies in malaria associated with the follow-on year from El Niño, so really associated with the El Niño year. So southern Africa, we know, is dry during the El Niño, so malaria goes down, malaria control people are happy. We know in the highland areas, during El Niño, it tends to have a bump in minimum temperature. This is data from Carina, and you can see a large jump, about 1 degree in minimum temperature there, which is associated with epidemics of malaria in the highlands. And you see that quite commonly in eastern Africa, which gets unusually warm during an El Niño. This was the 1997 case, if you like, for the impact of El Niño. Is in Wajir in northeastern Kenya. What happened there was huge inundations that were associated with the rainfall, massive flooding, as you can see in the graph on the left-hand side, major malaria epidemic, non-immune population, catastrophic death rates. 5% of the population died from malaria in a number of weeks. So those are the sort of catastrophic health outcomes that you can get from an El Niño in an environment where there is really no capability to control the disease. But lots of things have changed, and I've got some nicer changes than the ones that Mark showed, so a bit more cheery. One, the MDGs has come in and brought in lots and lots of money, not just the MDGs, but Roll Back Malaria, the Global Fund, billions of dollars going into malaria control and infectious disease control since 1997. The public health community, represented by WHO, was pretty slow to get its act together, but in 2007 it came on board in terms of seeing climate change as the, one of the most terrible things that are happening to health globally, so the big partners are involved there. We have massive changes in urbanisation and development, and this image on the left is from Ethiopia, 10% growth rates a year, huge change in the environment, in people's income, etc. And on the right-hand side, these gentlemen are all in a meeting with our colleague Pietro Ciccato, and he noticed they're all checking their mobile phones, so he could show them the climate information on their mobile phones. So technology changes also phenomenal in that time period. The specific work that I want to present to you really came out of the thinking from 2005, when we were involved in the Global Climate Observing System program gap analysis. And that identified, it was really the question was, if we invest in climate data, will it improve the outcomes for the MDGs? And this is the question from the development agencies. We came to the conclusion it wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference. Mainly because data by itself, unless you have services, unless you have a community that can use that information, unless you have a policy-enabled environment that allows people to change decisions based on that information, new data by itself doesn't do that. So, from that process, we've been looking, well, how would you bridge between the climate community, particularly in the African context where the underlying infrastructure has been so weak for so long and in decline, and the public health sector. And I think this article here, which came out in 2006, the lead author was the Minister of Health in Ethiopia. He then became the chair of the Global Fund, and subsequently, I think he's the, I'll be corrected here, the Foreign Minister in Ethiopia? Anyhow, leading figure. He did his PhD on climate and malaria, has a very good understanding. And his plea in this article was, we must enable the health sector with climate information that serves their needs. And this is the work that has developed, if you like, out of that process called Enhancing National Climate Services Initiative. And the basic idea, the concept is fairly simple. It's to improve the availability, the access, and the use of climate information in a comprehensive approach with a focus on national decision making. And yeah, it's very simple. You get the national data, the whole of the national data, working with the national meteorological agencies, who are the central partner in this process. You clean that data, blend it with the best global products, and get the highest resolution, best quality data for decision making at the national level. And the difference that you get in the data is on the left-hand side, ARC rainfall estimates, for instance, can use the 17 stations that are uploaded into the global telecommunication systems of WMO, whereas the National Meteorological Agency has its own monitoring stations, and their products are represented in the middle here, where they can use all of their routine monitoring information. But if you go back into their archives and clean up the archives, you can create the archive databases based on the entire national observed data for Ethiopia. And this is just, we started in Ethiopia, worked to move to Tanzania, and now I think we have 8 countries in Africa that are building this system. And the great thing about having a nationally owned quality control database for the country to work with is that they can then go and look at other information. What's the history of El Niño on the climate of our country? And they can get that information in a lot of detail that can improve not only the understanding but how you use the information in decision making. A quick example, comparing for Tanzania a national analysis of a weighted anomaly standardized precipitation index, which we use for drought assessment. On the left-hand side with CMAP, on the right-hand side with their new INACS data. And what you see is that the El Niño, 97 El Niño, really stands out because you've got a lot of observed data in there, and it's not just dependent on satellite data. The study we've done recently in Ethiopia in collaboration with the National Met Agency, but also the Ethiopian Public Health Institute, was to really try and understand what is the history of El Niño on the climate of Ethiopia. We see on the left-hand side the history of drought in the July-September period. In the central image, the history of excess rainfall in the October and December period. And very significantly for malaria, the history of high minimum temperatures throughout the rainy season on the right-hand side. So, in order to be able to simply explain to user communities the uncertainty in all of the information, that information, if you like, is presented here. This is for the July to September drought for Amhara. And you can see there the red lines represent periods of low rainfall or of rainfall during that period. And most of them are either below normal or normal, but there's no above normal during that period. And that's just visually, you can understand that. Anybody can see that there's a tendency for drought, but it's not certain. Each year has a different response, and when you have a La Niña, there's a tendency for more rainfall. Well, it's curious in Ethiopia, actually, because for a long time we've done a detailed study on this. It was very hard to understand why you should get so many malaria epidemics that follow droughts. And one of the reasons is that you get this complicated process of the El Niño creating droughts for the July, August, September, warming temperatures in the highlands throughout the period, and then excess rainfall following that in a time of disruption, low nutrition, etc., etc. So the climate itself, malaria is affected by a lot of things, and when we started this work 15 years ago, people said, yeah, but it's girls' education, it's vitamin A, there are so many things that impact on the way malaria occurs. But the nice thing about climate, and this is what I tell the health community, is that it's structured in a way that it can be used by a system, in a systems approach. And that's because of its climatology, its seasonality, its rhythm, its potential predictability at multiple timescales. That type of information can be used in health systems approaches to national planning, whether it's for around an El Niño, whether it's around seasonal planning, whether it's around risk mapping, etc. And this is just an image from a meeting we had with the rollback malaria executive team in Tanzania last year, also with the Ethiopian team, including both the Met agencies and the Ministry of Health, to discuss risk to the programs around climate and how they should incorporate climate information into that process. And I'd just like to say that many donors have become involved in supporting the ENACT's work across Africa, but all of this effort really was underpinned by the NOAA grant which we had at the beginning, which gave us the time to think through many of the challenges that we initially observed in the gap analysis, etc. at the time. There are so many people who have been involved in this. I have to say that Tupudinku, who I hope is in the audience somewhere, is the lead really on the development of the work with the Met services, etc. But many, many IRI colleagues are involved, and of course the Met services themselves. We have colleagues here in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carina. I always like to give a couple extra minutes to anybody with a British accent. Anyway, so we're hearing a little bit about what's being learned. We're also hearing a little bit about sort of how those lessons get embedded in practice. Next up, and let me just mention the format that we're taking today is basically we're having the speakers come up, holding the questions, having the speakers sit and ask each other a few questions for clarification, and then opening it up to the audience. Just a little bit more interactive in terms of how we're drawing comparative lessons. So next up, we have Lall, who is making his way to the podium to accept his Oscar. The director of the Columbia Water Center, Alan and Carol Silverstein Professor of Engineering at Columbia. His research, as everybody knows, spans a whole bunch of stuff, from global flood initiative to risk and financial investments, water, food, energy, and we're into Nexus these days. What's the plural of Nexus? So Manu is a widely sought advisor, as people know, across the world. And I think one of the major things he's done is actually the whole idea of building the consortium of universities for the advancement of hydrologic science and services. He's president-elect of the AGU Natural Hazards Group, which I happen to belong to. So Manu, take it away.
Okay, thanks. It's absolutely humbling as a hydrologist to show up before climate scientists, and I'll explain that. Years ago, Michael Gill invited me to give a talk at UCLA, and I talked about the rise of the Great Salt Lake in the 1980s, and David Nealon asked me right after I got through the talk, why do you think this happened? Before I could answer, Michael's response was, oh, don't ask him, he's a hydrologist. He'll just tell you it rained or it didn't rain. And so I've always realized after that whenever I'm talking to a climate scientist, and if they have a smile on their face, they're basically trying to tell me, I know everything you should know, but you don't know, and you'll never know. So that's kind of the context with which this comes up. Now, on water, since that's what I'm charged to actually talk about today, the first thing I'll mention is that the World Economic Forum for the last 5 years has rated water as the top risk, or one of the top 3 risks, for businesses around the world based on surveys they have done of businesses. So that's kind of interesting, but climate doesn't really figure into that prominently. What they are most worried about is social factors of risk, because companies may lose their license to operate because of chronic scarcity. This is kind of the emblem of all that. The question is, where does chronic scarcity for water come from? And as I just said, that's probably the climate scientist's job to figure out, and they should be blamed for it, really. Now, as you saw in the first slide from Roger, what was laid out was the timescales of climate variability, which, given what I've been saying, map directly into timescales of water availability variability and flood risk variability. So what do people do with that? The first thing is that if we look at water, it's typically managed, quote unquote, by the public sector agencies around the world. And it's managed in a sense where there's a recognition that this is a primary need for humans, translating to food, translating to energy, so you can't really mess with that. We want to set this up and we will run it the way we have with a straight jacket of rules. So if you come and tell me that you have a 90% chance of an El Niño happening next year, which is what we are talking about, their question is, well, can you be 99% sure that this will actually lead to a flood or a drought for me? And then if you ask them, what would you do if I was 99% sure, you actually get a blank stare most of the time. So this is one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is agencies such as the South Florida Water Management District and Tampa Bay Water in the United States, or, for example, the Philippines, or some places in the northeast of Brazil, where they take all the technical products that are developed at the IRI, improve on them, implement them, and map them into decision processes until the governor of Florida, for example, decides to get rid of all the research staff at the agency. And then everything disappears. And the same thing happened in northeast Brazil. So what I'm driving at is giving you the rosy picture that Mark Levy was giving, which is the way politics shows up in these things is to essentially try to defeat technical innovation, which is remarkable. So that brings me back to where I think we can have an impact, because clearly we have information to convey. There is uptake of information at various levels, and actually it's worth giving you an example of that too. Years ago, I gave a talk in Vernal, Utah to a whole bunch of farmers. This is 97, actually. And the question that I was asked was, you're making forecasts of various things. Can you give us the forecast for next year? And my question back to them was, I would love to. What are you going to do with my forecast? And the guy said, well, if it is dry, I'm going to maximize the area planted. And my reaction was, what? Please explain this. And the guy's response was, well, there's a crop insurance program. I'm not claiming that I'm going to actually farm, but if I maximize the land planted and it's dry, I'll make much more money. So my point with that particular example is that as you make institutional rules or you come up with strategies, there's always going to be someone there who is smart enough to see how they can leverage that. Which brings us back to away from the straitjacket of the public sector, over to the private sector, which recognizes that this is a major risk and wants to do something about it. So what we have seen in the last few years in particular is tremendous investor interest in figuring out how to deal with water risk in various ways, in mining, in agricultural products, and so forth. Many of these investors are not exposed to these risks, but others are. And what they are looking at are various ways of hedging those risks. So essentially the area of the world that has had the largest intersection with trying to understand climate variability at multiple scales and trying to map that into something useful is the financial industry, which is not necessarily as well organized. Which brings me to my final point that I wanted to make, which is after having worked in this area for several years and trying to work with many, many organizations, both public and private, using forecasts to guide different processes, ultimately, I think it boils down to the following thing. In every country in the world, and the United States, you could argue, is one of the countries that would like to be developing at the moment. One of the fundamental things that people are interested in is economic opportunity. How do you drive that? This is a long-term process with significant short-term horizons that come into play. So to address that, I think we need a linkage between structural mechanisms for managing climate risk. These can be infrastructure elements, or the way infrastructure is operated, or guidance that is given by agricultural extension programs, or strategies for introducing renewable energy sources. But these have to be backed up by financial instruments. So the linkage between those two is, I think, where the future is and where the action is going to be. However, as you talk to people who do infrastructure work, or you talk to companies who are investing heavily in new plants or supply chains, finding that they are paying attention to financial risk mitigation strategies is not really something that you hear very often. Conversely, when you talk to insurers and reinsurers, they are very happy to sell you those products, but they miss the opportunity that there is significant demand for lending for infrastructure development. And if you twin that with an insurance product, you have a tremendous ability to actually increase your bottom line. So clearly, with that last statement, what I'm going to say is that I'm looking forward to not being in academia and being the next billionaire to run against Donald Trump in the next 3 presidential elections if they allow me to. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you.
That's the orange hairpiece, both of you. Well, excellent. Okay, so we have Carina Bachofen next. I want to keep in mind a few things here as we go through, as we create some threads to create a discussion here. We heard quite a bit from Manu about again, the role of the private sector. We have to ask some questions as well as the public function that the private sector plays, but also, as we know from a lot of insurance and everything else, who's the insurer of last resort? It's you, right? It's not the private sector. During a disaster, things like that, it becomes the public good. So we need to balance out those capabilities with how one sustains activities over time. That's very illuminating, man. And I always like to say, to my friends in hydrology, that rediscovering non-stationarity was the best thing since we rediscovered on sliced bread. It's sort of like something climate folks have known for a while, but we're going to get back to these discussions tied back to that and stuff, right? So we have Carina up next, the Senior Program Manager and Policy Officer at the Red Cross Red Crescent. She heads the learning and uptake with DFID's flagship program in building resilience and adaptation to climate extremes and disasters, or GRACE. She's worked at the World Bank, the IUCN, the German International Security Affairs. And I particularly wanted to make sure we hear from Carina Bachofen, because the idea of learning is so critical, right? It's not, we used to think interdisciplinarity, physical, social, integrate them, but where does learning take place? How are assumptions refined and revised? Who does the learning and who benefits? Carina.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carina Bachofen. I work for the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. For those of you that don't know what the Climate Center is, we are a reference center for the Red Cross Red Crescent, and we really focus on the humanitarian implications of climate change. So what does this mean? Well, we have experts in our team that are spread out all around the world, so contrary to being the Climate Center, we are quite decentralized, and my colleagues are either experts in one or more of the following areas: policy, practice, and science. And we really try to ensure that scientific rigor is used to advance policy processes so that local action on the ground can really benefit the poorest and most vulnerable that will be most impacted by increasing extreme events and climate change. So today I want to just be very, very practical and give a couple of examples of the way that we are bridging policy, practice, and science, the way that the Red Cross Red Crescent has been using, well, I should not say seasonal, forecasts more and more in disaster risk reduction, and how this has evolved over the past few years. One thing that we have learned to set out up front is that we have to be really innovative in the ways that we ensure that information is both accessible and relevant to a variety of different stakeholders. And we work with many different partners, as well as, of course, national societies in 189 countries around the world, to ensure that they can help build their capacity so they can really be most prepared for increasing climate extremes. So how is the Red Cross Red Crescent integrating forecasts into programming today? These are 4 examples I'd like to get into quickly, and I understand that we'll have more time to unpack them in the Q&A session that follows. Each of these are all different tools. The 4th one, GRACE, is a program which I'll get to. These are, again, tools that we have developed with very participatory, multi-stakeholder consultation processes, and that we're rolling out as we speak, and really constantly checking our assumptions, seeing what works, what needs to be revised. Learning is at the core of our strategy to impact. And I'm quite excited to share these with you today. Each of these do have very strong El Niño components as well that we've been able to really hone in on this year in particular. So minimum standards for local climate smart disaster risk reduction. I actually brought copies of this today if anybody's interested. The minimum standards were developed by the Climate Center and its partners as an answer to the question is, what is the minimum that should be done at the local level to ensure that disaster risk reduction actions are taking into account the changing climate? What is it that communities should be doing, and what is it that the civil society organizations that are supporting the communities should be doing? And these are this essentially is a very practical checklist of what can be done, and many of the guidance notes that the actions and the guidance that is summarized in the standards do really make reference to the importance of using forecasts. So for example, one of the standards that we've developed says that at minimum, where credible seasonal forecasts are available, the community has a reliable relationship with an organization that can help access and make use of the forecast. Now, is this reasonable? Is it reasonable to assume that this is something that at minimum communities should be able to do. Well, in the context of the Global Framework for Climate Services, we have been working with Tanzania Red Cross, who has in turn been in contact and in communication with the Met Services to say, well, when the Met Service receives a forecast that says there will be, for example, above average chance of rainfall, which is the case now, especially with El Niño, the Met Service sends an email alert to Tanzania Red Cross describing the situation, where in the country this is likely, and the Tanzania Red Cross then is in contact and convenes meetings with communities that will be affected and really explains to them what can we expect, what does this mean for preparedness actions, for really understanding what this forecast implies for their well-being, for their lives and livelihoods. And so this is a communication pathway that's being established from the Met Service through the Red Cross in Tanzania all the way down to the community level. And this is one example of how this minimum standard is being met in Tanzania. We're rolling this out, we're trying to contextualize minimum standards in many different countries around the world. And another thing is that it's a very useful tool for funders and donors to say, well, if I want to fund disaster risk reduction interventions, activities, how will I know that they really go beyond business as usual, that they are taking into account climate change, the changing climate and forecast. And here we can say, well, my plan, my project, my program takes into account the minimum standards, and so we are going beyond business as usual. This document is a live document. We continue to update it based on local experience. And it's really nice that we can use the GFCS as an umbrella for really taking this work further. I'm not sure how many people in the room have received the news that last week, Friday last week, humanitarian history was made. And one other tool that the Climate Center has been developing with its partners, including the German Red Cross and the IFRC, is an innovative funding model called forecast-based finance. We know that there's a serious shortfall of funding that exists between short-term disaster risk response and long-term disaster risk reduction. And what is the role that forecasts can play to ensure that, or to see whether we can release funding after a forecast but before a disaster materializes. Forecast-based finance is the model that is doing this, and it's really, again, rooted in scientific rigor, where we work together with the Met Services, together with local communities, and with the Red Cross, Red Crescent, with the National Society, to use this innovative mechanism whereby we have established standard operating procedures, what actions should be taken once a certain threshold is surpassed of the forecast. And once we know that, for example, there's going to be 60% more chance of above average rainfall, that can trigger action that has been elaborated in a standard operating procedure by a community. And funding is released after the forecast threshold has been exceeded, but before the disaster materializes. So last week in Uganda Red Cross distributed, I think it was 3,000 non-food items, including jerry cans, water tablets, and other items that would help reduce the risk of dysentery with increased likelihood of rainfall. And so this is really exciting for us. It's the first time that we have a humanitarian action triggered by a scientific forecast of flood risk. The items were procured under forecast-based financing, the funding was made available, and basically, in anticipation of this, the funding was able to prepare the communities for what potentially could be greater impact. The next example I want to give is the Pacific Adventures of the Climate Crab Toolkit. So again, how do we make climate information forecast accessible and relevant to a wide variety of users? The Vanuatu Red Cross, together with the Australian Red Cross, actually developed animations that are all about climate and weather patterns in the Pacific with special focus on El Niño and La Niña. The Climate Center had done some research, and we realized that there wasn't simple, easy to understand information about this that the communities could really act upon. And so what happened is that a team, including 3 climate scientists, 1 communication expert, 2 climate advisors from the Climate Center and the Red Cross Society, an artist, an animator, a project coordinator, a producer, that came together and over a year developed storyboards that would really tell the story of how climate processes in the Pacific unfold, what are possible adaptation measures that could be taken, and that includes accessing climate information, communicating this information, and collaborating to take early action together. The films are quite short. I hope if we have time, maybe 4 minutes, I can share this with the group. Together with the films, we also prepared resource toolkits that can be used to raise awareness and train community members and other beneficiaries in what to expect, how to develop early actions through contingency plans. And basically what's really exciting about this is that it's a way that we've tailored the information, very complex. We spent the week looking at very colorful and, in my view, sometimes very, very complex graphs and maps. And this is another way to portray the same information in a way that communities can say, I get it. And it's reflective of their music, their culture. The housing and the animations are typical to what's the infrastructure or the housing materials that are used on, for example, Vanuatu. And we have local celebrities from that region that are actually the narrators. So this has been very exciting for us. We've had the animations be integrated in school curricula. National Met Services have, the government has taken this up. It's been shown on television, and Tonga Red Cross has taken this further, and they're using the animation for training in emergency response alongside education about the importance of seasonal forecast for preparedness. Finally, I want to just end on an innovative program where the Climate Center has really been charged with the task of ensuring that learning is taken seriously from the start to the end, not that we deliver all these exciting products and then we say, well, what have we learned? And that's almost an afterthought. Building resilience and adaptation to climate extremes and disasters is the UK government's largest program to date, probably the largest program in the world, that is all about answering the question, how do we build resilience to climate extremes? It's 13 NGO consortia operating across the Sahel, in East Africa, and in Asia, in 15 countries, and the knowledge manager is doing research on what's coming out of their work, their projects, monitoring and evaluation, again, and learning. One thing that we as a Climate Center has brought to Grace, that's specifically focused on El Niño, is the opportunity for these different stakeholders to connect within the program and also with experts outside the program. For example, around an issue such as El Niño. And my colleague Rup Singh here has been really organizing webinars and discussion fora and writing blogs and really trying to contextualize all of this information we're receiving about El Niño to local contexts. We're also working to inform the UK government country offices on how to do this. And it's really exciting. I'd be happy to talk to all of you more about this in the future. So maybe just to end, learning is at the core of all of this. We're using very innovative new tools. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't, but it's really all about how do you tailor the information, make it relevant, make it accessible. And here are some very practical examples of how we've done that over the past few years. This is a far cry from what the Red Cross for Crescent was doing in '97 and even in subsequent years. It's just, with so much information, I think we're really needing to find more and more ways to make this really something that resonates with all the different users in the UK. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, Carina. It was very illuminating. I mean, certainly the lessons of how we operated in 97, 98 and what's been learned since then and what's being put into place, including the concept of climate crabs. Yeah, I think. this is a fascinating set of folks. As you can see, it takes a whole lot of people to get these things done. But the issue is you're hearing from a hydrologist, an economist, an entomologist, looking in the social realm, and now we have a climate scientist. And so this gives us a sense of the breadth of talent that's being brought into these questions. So next up we have Alberto Troccoli, Director of the World Energy and Meteorology Council, visiting professor at East Anglia. Alberto, of course, has more than 20 years, as most, a lot of people in the room know, of experience in meteorology and hydrology, published extensively, but was also a contributor to the World Bank report on climate impacts and energy systems, and the lead author for the energy exemplar for the Global Framework on Climate Services. So, Alberto, please come up. So what we're going to do after Alberto speaks is bring out the chairs here, have folks sit down, ask a few questions among themselves, and then open it up to the audience. More broadly, about learning from the different approaches that you've been seeing, all of which have rich histories. Alberto.
Thank you very much, Roger, for your kind introduction. It was all correct, except that I'm not a hydrologist. But, all the rest is fine. And I want just to thank the organizers here for inviting me. It's very humbling to be here to have the energy world on my shoulders and defend such a huge world. And I also thank you for leaving energy as the last one in the list. I think it's just an indication of how important it is. It's probably the most important of all sectors, as you may recognize. You pull the plug, you don't do anything, your computers. So I just take on the challenge and go through this experiences of the energy sector through El Niño and other climate events. Before I do that, I just want to stop here and tell you what are the takeaway points from this presentation. So both the energy supply and demand are highly sensitive to climate variations. We won't have time to go into that, but it's a huge field. In terms of how things have changed since the last El Niño, and also since the last big El Niño, 97-98, to now, I would say there's no real step change as such, but the sector, because of the way the dynamics of the sector, it's quite active and so on, they continue to learn. They take on board whatever is available and they don't stop because one big event is coming. They may be hit, but they will continue. And the third point is also quite exciting because there is a growing and active community behind the climate services for energy, which are taking actions as we speak, also related to the global framework for climate services. So these are the takeaway points that if I don't have time to go beyond, I'd like you to take away, but also because I think I don't know much more than this. So don't squeeze me too much, and I'll try to give some examples in the next slides. I'd just like to point out, Roger, that this, I think, took me about 2.5 hours of Googling to put together this presentation. So you may want to revise your statistic and for the next presentation. So the energy industry, I want to give you a feeling for how complex the energy system here is. So I won't have time to go into the details. Just put a picture here with a lot of various aspects of this complex field. And so it goes from energy generated from traditional sources like oil, gas, nuclear, to the renewable energies, and then there are aspects to do with the transmission, with the distribution, with the extraction, exploration, and more importantly, actually, is the demand, because ultimately that's what you want to meet. You do all this exercise of creating all this energy because people actually use that energy, and that's the target. So you want to always balance the supply with the demand, and that's what it's in the middle with housing, petrol, and all the rest. So this is very briefly what the energy industry is about. Now, in terms of impacts, the energy industry has suffered many climate-related impacts. One of them, which is related to ENSO, not quite El Niño, but it's the reverse, La Niña. So in 2011, there's some large, extensive flooding in Australia, and that caused, as you can see here, damaging impacts on the coal extractions. This is an example from Kenya that I stole from my colleague Christopher Olude, who was doing some work in trying to use seasonal forecasts to provide this information to the hydro plants in Kenya. They go through quite wild cycles of water availability there, and they think that seasonal forecast is going to be a very useful tool to overcome some of the issues they're having with the supply of hydropower there. Another example, not related to ENSO in particular, but it's still quite a major event that happened in 2003 in Europe. There was this vast heat wave that hit Central Europe. One of the impacts was on electricity production by nuclear. Who would have thought that nuclear is also affected by climate? In fact, it is, because even nuclear plants require water to cool down their thermal generation system. So in that instance, the water got to such a level which was not low enough to be used for cooling, and as a consequence, France had to stop generation from a large number of nuclear generators, and they actually had to import electricity. So that's quite a major impact for a country which relies on nuclear electricity for between 70 and 80%. Another consequence of ENSO in general is this swings that you see in, for example, solar radiation. This is a case for Australia. And we studied here what are the differences between the solar radiation incident on the ground, which would be used, for example, by solar power, between the two phases of ENSO. So these are the differences in winter on your, in winter on your left, and in summer on your right, between El Niño and La Niña. And you can see, particularly in summer, when only the solar radiation is at the highest, you get changes, variations that could be as high as 10–15%. I mean, this is huge. Over a season, that kind of difference is huge. And the importance of this is that solar power developers will use records for dimensioning their solar plants over, say, 1, 2 years, 3 years at most of in situ measurements. They can extend it with satellite, of course, but the local measurement is normally very short. And what happened in the past, particularly with energy, was that they were financing wind power developments on the basis of 1 or 2 years, 3 years of data, and then they realized that actually the climate has some interannual variability. And the banks were not happy about that, because they said, you know, you're going to produce this and now you're giving me this money back, which is insufficient. It could be 10% difference, which is huge in terms of financial returns. So this has very important implications. Of course, this is regional. Australia will be one of the countries which should be most affected by these variations. Europe less, US less, but still, you know, you can find very large swings in, and so this is very important now with all the assessments that are going on in terms of wind, solar, and other new renewable energy sources, particularly. All these effects and many others are described in several publications, and I selected here a few, starting from probably one of the first in this area. There's actually another one, but in 2010 the World Bank got into that. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development also has a publication on climate impacts, as well as the World Energy Council, and then we had this publication that came out of the International Conference on Energy Meteorology and was published last year. Now the exciting thing is that action is taking place through also the Global Framework for Climate Services with the new energy exemplar that has been produced and approved by the Council. And so now it's time for action. Of course, climate services is not new in energy services, in energy industry, but what this global framework will do is to provide that extra level of coordination, which is it's recognized as a very important step to optimize the use of climate information. And so the next steps for this global framework will be very briefly around the finding the partnerships that will provide the leadership for this global framework, and then identify pilot activities, and of course knowledge sharing, which is key on all these activities. Behind this also there is an organization that is emerging, which is the World Energy and Meteorology Council, whose primary role is to enable improved sustainability, resilience and efficiency of energy systems under ever-changing weather and climate for the greatest benefit of all people. WEMC, as we call it, is headquartered at the University of East Anglia in the UK. The WEMC actually came out of a series of conferences that, and other activities before, but the first one we'd like to recognize as the 2011 conference in Australia, the first Energy Meteorology Conference, followed by the second one in France and the third one in the US last June. Sorry, Roger, how many bonus minutes do I get with an Italian accent?
You get one.
Just one? All right. Okay, thanks. And in fact, I finished, I go back to my takeaway points. I was just joking, sorry. So both energy supply and demand are highly sensitive to climate variations. There's no real step change in the way the energy industry has adopted climate information. It's a continuum. Energy systems are very aware of the impact of climate. They use climate information. Some of the companies have many experts, like EDF has a very large research group inside the company. Not all can afford that, but it's a sign that they're very aware of the issues. And as I said, there is an active community which is developing climate services in support of the energy industry. And you'd be very welcome to join the bandwagon. For more information, please ask me. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
So, will all the accents please come up and sit the front here? We're going to have a little question and answer. It's fascinating, the whole spread of things that are going on. Yeah, you need the mic? All right. Everybody's moving around on stage. So we're going to have a little opportunity for back and forth. I wanted to while we're here, as we're all gathering, is that on the sun?
Yeah.
I want to recognize a few people in the audience, just because we've had the development of these ideas from 1998 all the way through climate services. People have been involved in things like the ARPOS and so on from the beginning. Jim Beiser, Lisa Vaughn, Melissa Raphael, Max Dilly, and some really influential folks in how we design these ideas to get to climate services and the science behind it. Mike McFadden, Walter Betkin, Steve Zibiak, and really the men in hydro services around the world that we rely on, the people like Simon Mason and others work with. We sort of have to remember where the capabilities and capacity actually exists. There's a whole thing in the policy sciences called knowledge in a process is not knowledge about a process. Studying about something is not the same as being in it. And the responsibilities rest very much with those services. I want to make sure we keep that in mind. So, clarification questions from any of the panels about what you've heard from each other.
I'll start for Alberto. One of the things that's been very interesting for us is looking at development of renewables and the possibility that the climate information translates into positive and negative correlations between solar and wind and hydro. So your Australian example was very interesting. How widely is this kind of issue getting analyzed?
Okay, thanks. So this is an area which is actually quite well studied in some countries. So the countries that are pioneering these studies are Spain, Germany, US, Australia to an extent. And these actually are related to a wider type of study, which is the quest for 100% renewables. I mean, whether you achieve it or not, it's a different matter. But in order to get there, it's recognized that one of the possibilities is to balance wind and solar because, you know, there are some areas. So Spain is demonstrating that it's quite effective, that balance is quite effective. And Australia would be too. And so, yeah, it's quite advanced, and I can give you more details, but it's something that is looked at quite closely, particularly because, you know, people that are proponents of renewable energy, they are always criticized about the security of energy, and so this is one way to get around that. I mean, obviously you can't solve the whole problem, but it's one way to attack it.
Just a quick clarification on that. From most of the literature I've seen on that, they focus on the diurnal cycle. And I'm more interested in El Niño kind of time-scale relationships. Is that also being looked at?
Yeah, the studies would look at long-term type of climate. Of course, I mean, you have to take assumptions because you need to realize that if you want to solve the whole energy system problem is hugely complex. You go from, you know, the lights here are balanced at 1 second or shorter. So if you want a model that gives you that kind of resolution, it's going to be impossible. So you have to make a number of assumptions for that.
I'll ask Carina the question.
I was going to ask you one.
Thanks, please bear with us. A big part of the reason for doing this is just we're trying to draw out from these very different cases what people have actually learned for their own cases as well.
Well, what I was interested in, you mentioned within the climate sense the importance of science and being able to translate the science, but we know in the humanitarian environment it's extremely difficult to build evidence because of the short nature of many emergencies, the lack of data, etc. And I was just wondering how you dealt with that within the climate centre.
Right, so thank you. I would say that right now we're shifting more and more from just delivery oriented to actually documenting these lessons learned practices with the forecast-based finance pilot that happened that made history last week in Uganda. We're documenting those lessons, but these pilots are actually taking place in 15 other countries, and so we'll be able to see what lessons does the experience in Uganda offer for the other countries. And in terms of how we document it, I think it also matters who's your audience. And so is it a short policy brief? Is it a working paper that goes into more technical details? Is it a short video? Is it used to be used for training purposes? So we're also always seeing what are the different formats, who are the users, and yeah, what is the best way? It's not just enough to write a report and then that sits on the shelf. How do we actually make sure that the lessons that are being learned, the evidence base that's being generated is actually being, again, made accessible and relevant to be actually put to use. So this uptake component is something that we're focusing on quite a bit.
Other quick questions?
Can I ask a question?
Please, of course.
One statistic that startled me in the presentation was that if I
It's very hard to hear.
Oh, sorry, Ron.
So one statistic that startled me in your presentation, sorry?
They're dynamic speakers, but there's some static.
I'll just speak loudly for now, was that the 5% of the population that died from malaria, and I wonder how the communication channel was in that situation. Between having the climate information and having it reach all the way down to the community level.
Yeah, if it gets any worse, we'll have to ask you to stop helping. Please, go on.
Yeah, the catastrophic epidemic that occurred in '97 in Roger was effectively, it happened when there was a nurses' strike. So I think it's picking up. So there are many other things going on in Kenya. And the first was that the health sector were not paying attention to the El Nino. There were others, I remember different at the time, who there was some staff who were trying to alert people that something was going on, and they picked up information through Usenet. But effectively, the health sector and malaria control program were not engaged. They were also distracted because very early on with the floods, there were Rift Valley fever epidemics, and so a lot of attention went to Rift Valley fever, but at the same time, actually, there was a massive malaria epidemic. And so there really wasn't any control going on. They couldn't get in the services because the roads were all flooded, the facilities were all flooded, people had all scattered to try and find slightly higher ground, because it's a very low-lying area. So the whole multiple of factors over this very short period of time, and what it landed up when we talk about catastrophic death rates, they're set at about 10 per 10,000 per day in the humanitarian community, which is like a mega disaster. And the death rates in children were like 24 per 10,000 per day in the five. So it was a really totally unmanaged situation without drugs, without facilities, people couldn't get there. Now it's hopefully not going to be like that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So before I throw it out to the audience, I had a quick couple of questions, one for Madeleine. We've heard a whole lot about infrastructure, and we've heard about different kinds of partnerships and early warning and how things have changed over time. We know we adapt and adjust through crisis learning and redesign, through our infrastructures, through our integrated systems like coastal zones, but you're dealing very much with a behavioral issue. And I'd like you to basically say something about how you work on one of the biggest issues we have, which is the reporting of different stations that are not included in the normal global reporting systems that are actually valuable for use in what you're doing in East Africa. And in other words, how that came about, right? And the help and the importance of that, because we have a big issue, certainly in famine and early warning, with not having all the stations before, but you've been able to access some of those. And the second question to Manu, the issue of the private versus public is critical, and I'd like any insight you have drawn from how we might govern that process best to make sure that the public good is being served, as opposed to just single benefits. Madam.
So, first of all, it's not that we access the data, and the key thing, and I think, like we all sit here in New York, we like to access data from around the world. A lot of decisions are being taken about big finances and stuff like that actually outside of the countries. So the process that is developed under the ENACTS initiative is very much like information for national decision making, and based on the national data and the national capacity to integrate that data with the best global products. And if you don't mind, I would like to just introduce our colleague, Deriva Carina from the National Meteorological Agency. If someone could give him a mic, he could just explain to you why it's relevant to Ethiopia rather than me.
Well, you were a hyperlink for a moment.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madeleine. My name is Troccoli.
Can you hear?
You have to be loud, I think.
Yeah.
This is America. You have to.
Yeah, you have to be loud. We won't listen. We won't listen anyway, but you got to be loud.
Is it okay now?
Okay, this is Dave.
Okay, my name is Troccoli from National Meteorology Agency of Ethiopia. I'm a former student from the University of Kenya. As Madeleine mentioned, we are the first country in Africa who started to issue the seasonal forecast in 1987 after the Kennedy model started issuing the Niño forecast. Since then, we are enhancing our capability to provide early warning based on seasonal climate conditions. As we heard about yesterday from various speakers, Ethiopia was quoted in terms of disasters like hunger as well as famine in relation to droughts. Particularly 1987, 1984 are one of the exemplary which come out to be the devastating part of Ethiopia. When we define the extent to what this drought caused famine in Ethiopia, we found that the main triggering factor is El Nino, like 1972-73, 1983, 1987, 1997, 2002, and current year 2015. But the situation which we have currently experiencing is quite different from that we have had in 1987, 1982, and 1972 as a result of well-established and well-informed climate prediction system we established in National Meteorology Agency of Ethiopia. In addition, we are the prime users of the IRI ENSO forecast since starting from early 1990s, and particularly currently we try to sort out the demand we got from the government as well as the public, particularly in optimizing or utilizing the climate information at grassroots level. So the difficulty we have had was our limited capacity to cover in expanding our meteorological station, particularly over remote areas. So I come up with the idea to blending meteorological observations with that of rainfall estimation from different satellites, like Thomson or other sources of information. Currently, we fill the gap, particularly in accessing and also disseminating climate information for the remote area of that, though for those parts of the community who have never had the chance to get information as early as possible before the onset of rainy season or dry seasons. Particularly, we come up with the idea to establish climate and health working group in middle of 2004, 2005, I remember. Now currently the Ministry of Health is the prime user of our climate information, particularly in mitigating before the onset of rainy season, how the epidemic nature of malaria, particularly during after the rainy season, particularly which can really affect wider part of Ethiopia, particularly during the dry season, which is October to December. As we know, October to December is the dry season, but during El Nino, that is the time when you have excessive rain, which leads to flood and so forth. So we are really capacitating our service in using climate information to inform the decision makers as well as the user community to mitigate adverse effect of climate-related hazards. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for the input. So one more response from Manu, and then let's throw it out to the audience for a few minutes here.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is the Shakespearean quote, which is all the world's a stage and the men and women just be actors. There's the public actor and there's the private actor in this game, and there's the economist. The economist will tell you, get the price right and everything is solved, right? And then you ask them, how do you do that? And they vanish. So the thing that I've learned is that I think if you frame the problem as a gain problem, with very low probability of success, but as a gain problem, the private sector moves very quickly. The public sector is immobilized. So that's the behavior of these two naturally. So given that the private sector agent is likely to move on this kind of information, I think the main safeguard we have is a very strong degree of transparency as to the kind of impacts that will result from different actions. And this is best exemplified in the carbon disclosure kind of things that every company is now being forced to adopt.
Okay, great comment, because I mean, a big part of this we have to remember is certainly in the private sector, if you're right 3 out of 10 times and you amortize your risk, that's okay. In the public sector, you pretty much get, well, but you pretty much lose if you're wrong in any year in particular. So it's just something to keep in mind in different ways we make decisions. Okay, so we are on time. We're only 10 minutes behind, and what I thought we'd be 30 minutes behind right now, so we're 20 minutes ahead. Questions? Oh, excellent. Michael, Cedric, and you can introduce yourself when the mic comes here. Okay? Thanks. So Mike, then Cedric, and I'll look to the wings.
So this, I think this is a question for Madeleine, but it might be for others.
Okay.
At the end of the 97-98 El Nino, NOAA made an assessment of human and economic impacts. I think it was really one person, Doug Sponberg, and he came up with a number of $36 billion in economic losses, which is probably $50 billion in today's dollars, and 23,000 fatalities, mostly ascribed to spread of infectious and contagious diseases in the developing world, malaria, dysentery. And so there's two questions, and I guess a comment. Questions are, how credible are those numbers in your estimation? And if they're credible, do they serve as a reasonable baseline for evaluating how much progress we've made in disaster risk reduction for this event? And the comment is, it seems like we need something systematic like this planned now for 2015-16.
So, I'd first like the credibility of the infectious disease deaths, I would say is not credible. And the simple thing is that those calculations were made, I imagine, at the time from sources like the CRED disaster database, which, and what's put into the CRED disaster database.
Can you use the microphone?
Oh, you can.
It's in your lap.
Oh, sorry.
There.
Sorry.
Having a tool doesn't mean you know how to use it.
Hello.
Greetings.
So, at the time, epidemic malaria was not included in the CRED disaster base. The reason for that is that most countries did not distinguish between endemic malaria and epidemic malaria is not included as a reportable disease. And if it's not a reportable disease, doesn't matter whether you die from it, you don't get reported. So that's, so it wouldn't have captured all the infectious diseases. I think those sort of estimates are immensely challenging to make because people often don't know what the actual baselines are anyhow. But I know that the Wajir epidemic, for instance, did not appear in the CRED disaster database.
Good. Some credulity. Anyway, so Cedric, and please introduce yourself. That you're Cedric.
I'm Cedric. I'm a climatologist with the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, and I have a question for Alberto. In the context of small island developing states, where energy supply poses a real risk to the economy, but also politically, because SIDS are mostly importing countries, and therefore they rely on their foreign currency reserves, but much of that is spent on oil to fuel their energy needs. What is your view, given that there is very little adoption of any kind of needs for climate information in the energy sector? What is your view from a GFCS standpoint on the SIDS with respect to energy?
Please.
Okay, thank you. Hello. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Cedric. So it's very important. This is a very important issue, and I try to answer very briefly. I mean, obviously it's complicated, but there's been investments. I know of several investments in the Pacific Islands, for example. The main issue is that when you set up a new system, energy system there is essentially isolated, so you can't rely on a big grid. And you have to, particularly if you rely on, say, on solar, because the resource is great, say, in those places, then you still have periods when you don't have much production out of solar. The interesting thing now is actually that in this particular period in time is that battery storage, electrical storage is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So some has been used already, and so what it does is that basically you can balance what is produced overcast day. You can keep it for a day or two on storage, And because the cost is going down, so that then these are more affordable, and we can then get away from reliance on the diesel generators more and more. So at the moment we're not quite there yet, but it's and the thing is that actually just on the climate services, they are going to be important even with the battery storage, even if you think the storage is there, because you want to always optimize the lifetime of all the equipment, particularly the battery storage. It's a costly device, and also that you need to look at the environmental impacts and disposal and so on. So using climate services in the best way, also in that context, provides more longevity for the systems and a more balanced also supply of power.
Thank you, Alberto. So please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Alex Harvey. I work for the UK Department for International Development, also currently based in Barbados. And in the 2 days I've been here, I've managed to get a cold, so I'm desperate to get back to a sensible climate again. My question for the sector leads. We had a little bit of discussion there on looking back on the improvements and the lessons since the last major event. I'm really interested in picking up on the first question we had just now and some of the issues that came up yesterday. What do you think from your sectoral perspectives the major gaps are looking ahead? Not necessarily in the next couple of months, but a time after this event, post 2015. I mean, are we looking at more pilot work, scaling up work that we know works, exists, or sort of more evaluations? Be interested in your perspectives on what next for the sectors. Thank you.
Please, go on. Go across the board.
Yeah. So certainly in the health work that we've been doing, and the ENACTS work doesn't just apply for health, though. It's being used in our agricultural work here at the IRI. We're informing the disaster community as well using it. But the key thing for me is that from the health sector, you need a systems approach. You can't have a sort of piecemeal bits and pieces of information. And also, if you have a system which only wakes up every 5 or 10 years because there's a big event, then you really won't have the people who are knowledgeable, who can use the information, the system won't be in place, etc. So very much I see the El Niño as part of the climate risk management strategy, and that for the health sector, climate is just another source of information that is relevant to a whole range of health sector decisions. And they can use that information in terms of seasonal planning, in terms of geographic risk, in terms of year-to-year variability and El Niño, looking at longer-term trends, etc. And one of the areas that we found most buy-in, in fact, from the malaria community in particular, is none of those. It's actually the use of climate information in impact assessment. So they have to justify, the President's Malaria Initiative have to justify to Congress the $1 billion expenditure on malaria. And they do that by saying, we have seen a decline in child mortality by X% for so many cases over the set time period, which is a very difficult thing to do with health data. It's just a very challenging thing to do. But it's particularly challenging in a region like East Africa, when between 2000 and 2010, you've had 3 major droughts. So did the droughts reduce malaria, or was it all the interventions? And so we've worked with them very closely to say you have to use climate in your accountancy. And by doing that, they don't come and look at climate every 10 years, they have to do it every year. Every time they look at their budgets, every time they do a report, was the climate a factor? Did it make it more difficult to deliver our malaria interventions, or did it make it easier? That's what we're looking at, is just integrating basic information in a routine way and an organised way into a system such that when unusual things happen, it jumps out and they are ready and know what to do with it.
I mean, a key thing there is understanding how those relationships are changing over time, because they will. And
exactly. So
any others? Thanks.
I guess I can say, it's going to be easier. Okay, so I'm not as obnoxious as it is.
You think you have other bad qualities?
Yeah, I know. That's so the thing about the water sector that's interesting in this regard is that water is so precious that it effectively ends up with no economic value. And the context in which this becomes important is that if there is a system which is very poorly managed, and by that what I'm referring to is that for agricultural water use or water use efficiencies around the world are typically around 15 or 20%, with the exception of Israel, which actually doesn't do agriculture, it does something else. And if you look at urban water use, you have losses that are, in most cases, around 40% of the water in the system. So when you have that degree of mismanagement or poor management, bringing in a significant perturbation actually is a fantastic opportunity for an improvement of that system. So I think that's where this goes. There are two obstacles to getting that stuff to work right. Obstacle number one is that around the world we seem to have no idea of water use. We don't measure it. So if you don't have an idea of what it's being used for, it's very difficult to talk about improving that state of the story. The second area with regard to the climate is we get a lot of hype every time there's an event which is significant from a climate point of view and has significant impacts. The memory of these events is relatively short. And then every time something like that happens now, unfortunately, there's a bogeyman called climate change on which this is masked onto. And we don't have, the gap that is there is long records of precipitation or water availability in many of these areas so that you can properly characterize the exposure that we have. So the exposure and vulnerability side are the major gaps around the world.
All right. Quick last comment, if you don't mind, just because we're into the break and the boss is on my neck.
Oh, wow.
I have
sorry, boss. Yeah, so quickly, I think this is a very important point which actually cuts across the various sectors, and that's an area where collaboration should be sought, and that's around the observations, taking the right observation, because most of the time, like for water, water observations will be very relevant for, in our case, for hydropower, but we have overlapping observations with agriculture, with solar, with health, and so on. And there are many examples of countries where you put the observations there for 1 or 2 years, and then you forget that you have an instrument, it gets rust, and so on. So, like with your gap analysis, the observations maybe was not the key factor, but it's certainly a very important point for the climate record, and one that can actually link the various activities in the global framework. So I'd like to also take opportunity to have this as an invitation to collaborate closely.
So the final comment from Carina, Yang.
Very quick, reiterating what my presentation said, and also what Charles raised yesterday from the WFP. Really looking forward, we're keen to establish a more solid evidence base on how we can adopt an anticipatory philosophy. So how can you take action before a disaster actually takes place? And maybe to add to that, we're looking more and more into conflict-prone areas or fragile states, which ties nicely to the presentation this morning. What can we do? How can forecasts be used in these settings where sometimes there isn't a functioning government, and let alone is there access and translation of these forecasts that can really help improve some early warning, early action.
Perfect, great, thank you, please thank